everybody. Y'all ready? Let's begin. Terry, if you will take us to the next slide, or the first slide, start us off with some discussion. What's the best way for you to know that your faith is genuine and that your faith is strong? How can you know that? Back table, what do you got for us?
When you know that you can never give up, if you're going through a rough spot, and you're just that drive to never give up and to keep going because God's got your back. Something's gonna pull through, whether in the end it'll help benefit you in some way, shape, or form. Just never giving up. That's what
Hang on, because you said something I want to ask you about. So you said you keep going whether it turns out for you or whether it turns out against you. Can you kind of expand on that? What does that mean?
Well, because some things are like surprise you or that you may not want to happen to you, but later on you understand why it happens to you.
Wow.
And it was all in God's path for you, right? And so that's why I'm like, you never give up on it, even if you don't understand or don't comprehend honestly like what. Just try to stay in your faith.
That's good. Anybody want to add anything to that over there? Nope. It's hard to follow. Ladies' table, what'd y'all come up with?
Really don't know until it's tested. Go through a hard time. Yeah, he pulls us through hard times, and like she said, sometimes it doesn't turn out like you. But time you realize it was God's will.
That's good. What'd y'all say? I mean, I kind of heard what you said, but I think we could all benefit from what you said because it was good.
Her answer was really. She said the best way to know that your faith is genuine and strong is you wouldn't worry so much. So
Wow.
I tend to agree with that. If you've got a strong faith, regardless of what comes your way, you probably you're going to get through it. You won't worry as much. So I thought that was a great answer.
It's really
It's
good.
like the fruits of your labor, like what you have to show for, when you're tested and when you meet adversity and all that, if you're able to, because we're tested, when someone cuts you off in traffic or, throughout the day we're tested, and how we respond is a direct reflection of how we're standing.
So your response to a challenge or an issue or a crisis tells you whether or not your faith is strong. It's good. It's good. Would we even know what faith was without challenges, trials, hardships, difficulties? Would we even need faith? Listen to what Peter said. 1 Peter 1:7. These trials, it is trials, will show that your faith is genuine. Your faith is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, though your faith is far more precious than gold. So, when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. So, we can't do a study of the book of Daniel without talking about Daniel's three buddies and looking at the fiery furnace story. So that's where we're going to go tonight. And the guys are going to help us answer this question. What do you do when you're in the middle of a fire? Peter, New Testament, said that when you go through a crisis, a struggle, a trial, it's like going through a fire. It's the process that God uses to refine you. So you're going to go through some fire. So what do you do? So before we get there and get the answer, I want to ask you just a couple more questions that you can discuss at your table. How does a trial or a crisis or a struggle or a difficult season prove your faith? And have you experienced that personally? Ladies' table. Oh, you got David. David's with you guys now. Ladies' table, why don't y'all... That's not the ladies' table anymore. Thank you. Thank you for balancing it out, David. Appreciate it. What? How did y'all answer this?
Faith is proven by how you respond to a crisis. And of course, everybody has experienced.
All of y'all experienced that? We're still going over here. I'm going to wait. You're good. You're good. You're on a roll. I was eavesdropping on your answer. Can you just kind of share what you were saying? Do you mind?
I think when if you don't have any trials, things are going good. It's easy to be like, well, that's all me. I'm doing the right thing. Just like a me. I don't need God. I mean, I don't think people. I hope not say that, but it's easy to fall into that, and then over time, those habits they'll catch up with you, and then you'll start going through trials, and then you'll start going, man, I need something, I need somebody, and usually you turn to God, and that's when you. But it's those trials that keep you close.
It is, isn't it? It's good. You guys in the back? You're exempt. You don't have to answer.
I just like we kind of agreed upon. It's like usually like for me, like we agreed upon like our weakest moments or even when like like the saying kind of falling away. Like usually you get in the habit of thinking it's all about you, or even if it's just for me sometimes not understanding something. It like hard to say, but like I said, I get the strong sense of anxiety. Like really affects me, and I go, man, like it's almost instant out of nowhere.
Wow.
And I start going to the Bible, and it's funny, almost every time, this happening, like it happened to me today, and then this happening, it's like,
Wow.
there you go, so, thank you for this question, actually.
Thanks for answering it, Eric. That's cool. That's cool. So here's what Jesus said, and then we got to figure out what to do with what Jesus said. It's kind of a good idea. It's a good practice. Figure out how to do what Jesus said. He said, here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows. That's a downer. But he's encouraging because he says, but take heart because I have overcome the world. So last discussion question at your table, how do you apply that to like daily life? What do you do with that statement tomorrow at work, with the kids, wherever you go? All right, y'all ready? It's a bummer sitting next to these guys because they're saying some really good things. So I so appreciate what you just said. Do you mind just sharing what you just said? Because we live in a world, and there are lots of people teaching us that if you're a good Christian, only good things will happen to you. If you're walking in faith, then nothing bad will happen to you. If you belong to Jesus, then you get all this good stuff, and you're exempt from all the bad stuff. There's a lot of that teaching going around. You can find that everywhere. You said the exact opposite. Could you just kind of share what you were saying?
Well, that's what I'm saying. So for a large portion of my life, I went to church in churches that kind of subscribed to that. And so recent years, I was when I kind of discovered that, like dissected, I guess, that particular verse. And then now just knowing that it's not all on me, these trials and troubles are going to come no matter what. And regardless that Jesus says, I've overcome the world. So, he's got it no matter how bad. So as long as we have, like we talked about building a house, as long as you have that firm foundation, something to hold on to, then it's just like weathering the storm, I guess, because it's going to come.
It's going to come. So if Jesus meant what he said, you can be following him, you can be full of faith, you can be trying to do everything right, and still you're going to have trials and sorrows.
Right.
It doesn't mean that if you have trials and sorrows, you're not living right. It just means,
Which I thought for a long time.
right.
I really thought for a long time that when something would happen, I just carried it all on my shoulders like I got to do better. I wasn't good enough, and disappointed everyone, and like that's a hard thing to unlearn.
Yep.
So
Thank you for sharing that. Back table, you want to add anything? How do you apply that?
Well,
have the trials that are of my own making,
Mm.
health, things that I do that are going to cause that. God didn't cause that, I caused it.
Mm.
And, you can lean on faith that happens, and then there's the big ones, and that's when I worry about to some degree, because I can't say that we've been truly faced with those big ones. That's,
Mm.
death of a family member, cancer, big things where, they're not necessarily going to pass. They can be with you forever, or it's not going to change. And so, like, applying that, I think, on the day, those other ones, like, hey, I can, take encouragement from God. I can change. I can influence those outcomes, and then you have the big ones that you can't do anything about, per se. And that's where you really are going to have to lean on Him, big time.
Yep.
And family, things of that nature. But I guess if I was in that situation, knowing that it is going to pass at some point, but yeah, that's one thing I worry about, because I don't feel like we've had a giant like that.
Interesting. Thank you. David and the ladies, what'd y'all say? Same thing? So can we agree with this next statement on this next slide? I think we can all agree with this, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page. You're either coming out of a hard time, in the middle of a hard time, or going into a hard time. Can we agree on that? I mean, either you've kind of just got some victory over a hard time, or you're stuck in the middle of one, or you're not aware of it yet, but there might be one coming. I mean, that's what Jesus meant by you will have. So if that's true, then I believe this next statement is true, and it's kind of the bottom line for tonight's talk. The key thought for tonight is a faith that is tested is a faith that can be trusted. And the opposite is true as well. A faith that's not tested is a faith that cannot be trusted. So it takes these tests and trials, and we're going to use the word fire tonight, to test our faith. And it brings us to these three teenage boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I know you know the story. I know you know it. And I know you know how it ends. But I want to remind you that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not know how this story was going to end when they were in this story. Okay? So don't jump ahead. They, just some reminders, they, like Daniel, were kidnapped in 586 BC when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, took thousands of them away, marched them through that gate, the Ishtar gate, down the cobblestone parade route through Babylon on those exact steps, took them to the palace, changed their name, changed their identity, changed their diet, changed everything about them, even who they were supposed to worship. And here's what Daniel chapter 3 says. The king, Nebuchadnezzar, made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and set it on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And then he sent his messengers to the high officers, the officials, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar set up, and then a herald shouted out, "People of all races." Now, when the Babylonians went and conquered you from modern-day Iraq all the way down into Egypt, they were taking people and transplanting them, just like Daniel and these three guys. So there's all sorts of different cultures there. So he's saying, all of you, people of all races, all nations, all languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground and worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Now, this is cool. We have this recorded in Daniel chapter 3, but this same decree written by King Nebuchadnezzar, you can find it in many, many ancient Babylonian history sources. It is written in the original Babylonian language, Akkadian, on a cuneiform tablet that is housed in the Museum of History in Israel. You can go see it. So it's not just a story in the Bible. This was like a legal declaration signed and delivered by this king. It's in stone. You can go touch it today. So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, all the people bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue of that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So everybody was bowing, just like they were told. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king. You issued a decree requiring that all people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn and all those musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, and their names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods, and they do not worship the gold statue that you have set up." Here we go. Here's the foundational layer of a strong faith. Building a faith that can be trusted starts with this. Faith obeys God instead of following man. Now, the key statement in what we've read so far is all the people bowed down. Everyone around those three guys had their face to the ground when they heard the music. Everybody bowed except for those three guys. They didn't pray about it. They didn't fast about it. They didn't take a survey. They didn't do a poll. They didn't post it on Instagram. They just said, "It's not for us. You can bow, but we won't." And there they stood. Faith that can be trusted obeys God, not man. So King Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage. You never want to make a king mad. And he ordered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments." Everybody ready? We're going to play the music. You got one shot. If you refuse, you will be thrown into the blazing furnace, and then what God will be able to rescue you from my power? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I have never seen this statement before until this study. They replied, "Hey, king, we don't need to defend ourselves before you." That is a bold statement, isn't it? The king can snap his fingers and have them killed. He's given them one chance. And they're teenagers, y'all. They are teenagers. They say to the king, "We don't owe you an explanation. We're going to honor God. This is what we do." For me, it's one more reminder that a strong faith is built on pre-decisions. This is what we see over and over in this book. That these men of faith, Daniel and these three guys, built a life on pre-deciding. I don't know if it was instilled in them from the time they were young or if on the journey to Babylon, they all got together and said, "Look, some crazy things are going to happen. We don't bow. Some crazy stuff's going to be offered to us. We don't take it." But somewhere along the line, they pre-decided wherever this takes us and whoever we stand before, we don't dishonor God. If it even looks like it might dishonor God, we don't do it. They pre-decided before they were tempted with it. Because if you wait till you're tempted to make your decision, the stakes are too high. It's too easy to cave in. So they had built even a teenage faith on pre-deciding, this is a line I will never cross. This is a line I will never cross. This is a line I will never cross. Pre-deciding who they were. Now in my mind, the guys could have rationalized, justified, or compromised. It would have been so easy just to say, "Okay, thanks for giving us one more chance. Let's talk about it." And they could have had a little huddle and they could have said, "You know what, guys, it's just one time. Let's just bow down and make the king happy, and then we'll go home and we'll ask God to forgive us. It'll be okay. God will understand." Or why don't we just bow down and pretend that we're worshiping, and we'll really be talking to Yahweh, but they'll all think that we're praying to the gold statue. It'll look like we fit in, but we know in our hearts and in our minds that we're really not. But they were determined not to even look like, not to even bow down like everybody else. They were pre-decided. We're not going to do anything that dishonors God. They just stood there together in faith. Here's what the king said, or here's what they said to the king after this. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. But then they also say this, he will rescue us from your power, your majesty. The original language should read more like this. He is willing to rescue us. So their statement here is like the second level in my eyes. Second level of building a faith that can be trusted. Faith obeys in spite of what it sees. What they saw was everyone around them bowing. What they saw was somebody stoking up a fire for people that don't. And yet they still said, we're not bowing. And we believe, number one, that my God is able and that my God is willing. You ever thought about that? Like in your own trials, in your own fires, in your own struggles? Let's go to the next slide, please, Terry. That God is able to save you. I think that's easy to believe. That God is able. I mean, I think anybody who's encountered or followed God for a while knows God can do a lot of stuff. I mean, he is capable. It's this second thing, this second statement that's harder to believe sometimes. They believed that God was able and God was willing. That God wanted to save them. So that was just the faith they lived on. God is able and God is willing. God is able and God is willing. But we have to come to the hard part of that second statement, and that's one of faith's toughest questions. And the question is, what if God doesn't do what I'm believing him to do? Have you been there? They didn't know the outcome, y'all. All they knew was they didn't want to dishonor God. They knew God could save them. They knew God probably wanted to save them, but they didn't know if he would or not. They didn't have any guarantees. What if God doesn't do what I'm believing him to do? What if God doesn't heal my sickness? What if God doesn't give me the job I'm praying for? What if God doesn't give us the family situation we want? What if how will I respond if God doesn't fix the broken relationship or get us out of debt or whatever? What if God does not do the thing you're believing he can and wants to do? That's when your faith gets tested, isn't it? That's where the rubber meets the road. Or here in a minute, that's where the flesh meets the fire. What do you do if God doesn't do what you're believing him to do? And that takes us to the third level, and I think the most important level of building a strong faith, and that is that faith knows I'm responsible to obey. The outcome is God's responsibility. I'm responsible to do what God says. Whatever he does with that is his job, his preference, his will. He can do whatever he wants. I'm going to trust him anyway. Listen to what they say. The boys just said, we believe God can and is willing to rescue us. And then they follow that statement with this. But even if he doesn't, we believe he can, we believe he will, but he might not. So if he doesn't, even if he doesn't rescue us, even if we're burnt crispy, we want to make it clear to you, King, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. And you can't let this story lose any power here because you know the ending. Okay, don't let it be diminished because you know how it turns out. They had no idea. They could see the fire getting hotter. They didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know if God was going to rescue them or not. That's the strongest kind of faith. I think the strongest faith is a but if not faith. It's a faith that says, I believe God can and I believe God will do these things, but even if he doesn't, I still trust him. Even if he doesn't, I still love him. Even if he doesn't, I bank on the fact that he's smarter than me, he knows what's best for me, and he has good plans for me. But if not, faith. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Now, I want to show you some pictures. Not yet, though. I want to show you some pictures because for generations, critics of the Bible, smart men, have criticized a lot of the Old Testament because some of the things just seem so unrealistic and we really don't have any evidence for them. And this is one of those stories that critics for generations have said, this is just kind of a metaphor. These things didn't happen. They didn't know what a fiery furnace was. What does that even mean? Until 1923. And in 1923, a British archaeologist found this. Oh, go to the next one. Those are supposed to be switched. Found that thing, this building foundation. There's hundreds of these all throughout Iraq. They really didn't know what they were until they started digging down. If you go to the next slide, in 1923, they rebuilt on top of it what this building would have looked like. That is a fiery furnace. We would call it a kiln. It's a brick furnace. Do you see all the bricks in front? See the thousands of mud bricks in front? The Babylonians built an entire empire with mud bricks, and they figured out early on that if you burn them, they become really, really strong. And so they built these buildings, hundreds of these buildings, with the capacity to burn thousands of mud bricks at a time. And this is exactly what a fiery furnace would have looked like to Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. This giant building with go back to the other slide if you don't mind, Terry, with fire, back to, I guess. Yep, with fire in these little slots just raging and coming out of there and heating up that whole building so they could burn thousands of bricks. So this is a real place. These guys were thrown into a real fire. Yeah, they took can you go one more? Or go back one to the building? Sorry, Terry, I keep jumping around. Yeah, when you come to an archaeological site, there's all sorts of just rocks laying around, and really smart people can kind of like put the puzzle together. And all over the Middle East, they rebuild what it would have looked like. The Ishtar Gate, the Blue Gate, it was just laying in pieces, but they figured out all the pieces go together, and it's a gate. They figured it out. Go to the next one. This is called in situ, which means as it sits, which means you start digging the dirt, and this is exactly what the dirt looked like. And then you can see all these other pieces just laying around, and you kind of figure out how the puzzle goes together, and you can rebuild it. And if you go, there's usually a black line. It's underneath the sandbags. The archaeologists will actually like paint with kind of a tar the black line of the line between how it sits, how they found it in the dirt, and then what they built on top of it. So you can tell. You can go to Chaco Canyon in northern New Mexico, and that's what they've done. And you can see the in situ line, and then built on top of it what they thought it would have looked like. Pretty cool. All right. Daniel chapter 3. So he ordered some of his strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into that building. And so they tied them up, threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king in his anger had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. This should have been a clue, right? The guys are still alive, but the soldiers who were throwing them in the fire are dead. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them in the fire?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god." Isn't that crazy? Most scholars believe that 4th person in the fire, take a guess, Jesus. Most scholars believe that Jesus himself came and stood in the fire with those men, and hung out with them till it was over. And that's super encouraging to me. That when Jesus said to his disciples, "I will never leave you and I will never forsake you," we can count on that. He was literally with them in their fire. And there's a 4th man in your fire. Jesus is with you in your fire because he's promised never to leave you, never to forsake you. Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of, remember, he had his own gods, and he was his own God, and he wanted people to worship him as a God. He declares, servants of the Most High God, El Elyon, the God Most High. Come out. Come on out of here. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them, nor had a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing wasn't scorched, and they didn't even smell like smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted him. That's Nebuchadnezzar's interpretation of the fourth man, that it was an angel. Could be an angel. Either way, God was with them. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. The king is beginning to have his eyes opened. This has happened with David, and now it's happening with these three guys. Or Daniel, now it's happening with these three guys. So real quick, here's the review. Building a faith that can be trusted starts with a faith that obeys God instead of following man. It obeys in spite of what it sees. And it knows that obedience is my responsibility, the outcome is God's responsibility, and he can be trusted with it. And I would say to you that a strong faith is bigger than you. That your faith in God is bigger than you. It's bigger than your faith. Because your faith impacts all the people around you, whether you're aware of it or not. If you're married, it impacts your spouse. If you have kids, it impacts your kids. If you have friends, it impacts your friends. If you have a church family, it impacts your church family. If you live in a community, it impacts your community. Your faith is bigger than just you. Listen to what these guys' faith did to the king. Therefore, the king said, I make this decree, and this is also written in stone. You can go see this declaration. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I will tear them limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. Their faith changed this nation. Their faith set things on a course that was about to set all of their people free. Your faith is bigger than just you. That's the end. Any questions? Comments? Snide remarks? That's you? You're up? Let me tell you what we're doing in January on Wednesday nights. I'm excited about this one. We're going to do a 7-week series called Feasts, Festivals, Parties, and Prophecy. And I just want to read this little statement to you, and then we'll call it a night. Of all the holidays and celebrations that our world celebrates, only 7 were ordained by God, given to us by God. And Christmas and Easter were not on the list. Each one of those celebrations pointed to Jesus. And you can understand the timing of the end of the world and the return of Jesus. When Paul told the Thessalonian church, you don't have to be ignorant about the way things are going down, like non-believers. If you understand the feasts, festivals, parties, and prophecies ordained by God, you can see the hand of God here at the end. We are in the end days. And you can see it played out in these festivals, feasts, and prophecies. We're going to look at them. Okay? Let's pray, and we'll call it a night. Thank you, Lord God, for everybody who has taken the time to be here to build a faith that is strong, to build a faith that can be trusted. God, I don't pray that we would face trials and struggles because it's hard, but we need those things. We need to be tested. We need our faith to be tested so that we can trust it. So my prayer is, God, that when we are tested, that we would always look to you, that we would always trust you, that we would see you standing with us in our fire, that we would obey you and honor you no matter what the outcome, and trust that you have a good plan for us. Help us to be people of great faith. In Jesus' name, amen.